In this chapter, we'll talk about long-term care. And when we think of long-term care, we typically think of the elderly, but I want to make a point here that long-term care can affect any age group. So when I was a kid, growing up, going to high school, I met a guy named Eric Coates. He was in the same grade as me. And Eric and I hung out a lot our senior year. We got to know each other our senior year. And then we hung out, we went to different colleges, but we would hang out in the summer for several summers. And we had a lot of the same interests. We were both English majors. We were both trying to become published poets. And, we have very full of ourselves in the way that you are when you are a young person. And this was back in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. We didn't have social media. We didn't have cell phones to text each other. So, we would see each other in the summer and then we'd mostly lose track of each other during the year. And eventually we just lost track of each other. One year, I guess, one summer, he just didn't come home, did something else. We just didn't reconnect the way we normally would. And I went off and joined the army after college and didn't see him again didn't see or hear from him again for about 20 years. And then reconnected with him and found out that he had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in his late 20s. He'd been hospitalized multiple times and was now, when we reconnected, was now living independently in an apartment in Keene, where we had, like I said, where we had gone to high school. But he had cycled from through a number of, like I said, a number of inpatient stays in order to get his disease process under control. And he had actually written a book, which I'm showing you the cover of, called Hearing Voices, a Memoir of Madness. So I'm not talking out of turn because he literally wrote a book about his experiences. Um, and Eric was a voice hearer. He heard voices that would tell him to do things. And most people who are voice hearers, the voices usually tell them if to do harmful things to themselves, and it's a very frightening experience. And the problem with schizophrenia is it is a chronic disease. Once you are diagnosed with it, there is no cure. There are ways to treat it to minimize the effects, but once you have it, you have to live with it for life. So this is a disability that Eric will deal with for the rest of his life. Most people are diagnosed with schizophrenia in their late teens. He was in his late 20s, and Eric is probably one of the smartest people I know, and I think that's part of why he was diagnosed later, is because he's so smart. People didn't figure out what was going on. So when we talk about long-term care, we're talking about some state of dependency, meaning as a result of a loss of your ability to perform either your instrumental activities of daily living or your activities of daily living, which we talked about in chapter 2, you're unable to live independently without some sort of supports. So a caregiver becomes necessary because you can't perform the functions that are necessary to engage in independent living on your own. And the situation may be temporary or permanent. And some individuals cycle between dependency and independent living, which is the situation with Eric. Periodically, his disease gets out of control, and he has had to be hospitalized multiple times, and has spent some time at the New Hampshire State Hospital, for example, which we've talked about in previous lectures. Now, the overall goal of the healthcare system is to maintain independent living. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So again, measuring disability, the most basic level are the activities of daily living, which we talked about in chapter 2. And this is the basic capability to perform personal care. And these measures, these 7 basic functions, are things that would be measured if you were going to be living in an institutional communal setting, such as a nursing home or assisted living. And so it's an evaluation of these 7 basic functions. As we discussed in chapter 2, you also have instrumental activities of daily living, or IADLs. And these are kind of a higher level capabilities that are mostly cognitive in nature. And they measure, again, a higher level of functioning. So whereas ADLs are focused on personal care, this is your ability to live in independent life. And so, can you communicate? Can you arrange transport, either drive yourself or arrange transportation? Are you able? Do you have the cognitive ability to shop on your own? Do you have the cognitive ability to pay your bills? Can you prepare meals for yourself? Can you do housework? So these are all IADLs, and they're requirements for living independently. Now, if you some of these things can be supplemented so that a person can continue to live independently. Another thing we talked about was Amartya Sen's idea of capability as freedom. He talks about functionings as doings and beings. These are the essential things that we need to be able to do to live as an independent human being. And then capabilities are the things that allow us to do the functionings. And so a person's capability set denotes the choices, the life choices that you have. So when we talk about functional limitations, there's kind of two main differences. You have acquired and congenital. So acquired means you're living your life otherwise unimpaired and something happens. You might be in a car accident, or you might have a stroke or a heart attack, and suddenly you have some new limitation. Congenital limitations are you are born with them. That's what congenital means. So you may have a genetic birth defect, or you may have been born uh, so have a bad birth outcome. So you may not have a genetic birth defect, but for example, if babies sometimes have the umbilical cord wrapped around their neck, this results in asphyxiation. So they lose they don't get oxygen as they're being born, and as a result, children could be born with cerebral palsy, which is damage to the nervous system, and results in physical impairments, sometimes cognitive impairments as well. And so, if you're in a car accident, for example, and you suffer a brain injury, you may have cognitive impairments as well as physical impairments. So I'll talk a little later about the David Krempel's Brain Injury Center, KBIC, that I work with. I'm on the board of here it's located in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and they work with people who have acquired brain injury. So David himself was in a car accident uh, and had a severe brain injury. And after that, realized that there were few resources in the community, and so using some of the settlement that he received, he created the David Krempel's Brain Injury Center. It's a great organization. We'll talk a little more about that. So on the cognitive side, we have limitations on things like remembering, learning, concentrating, making decisions that affect everyday life. So in my work with the Brain Injury Center, I've met a number of folks who are clients of the Brain Injury Center who were in car accidents. And I'm thinking of I've met a couple of nurses who, and I'm thinking of one in particular who was a intensive care nurse, an intensive care unit nurse, an ICU nurse. So a highly trained nurse, and she was in a car accident and had a brain injury and was never able to go back to work because her memory never worked the way that it had. And so she lives independently. She's married. She lives independently. If you met her, you probably wouldn't realize that she actually has had and still deals with the effects of her brain injury. And at the Krempel Center, we refer to brain injury as the invisible injury, because a lot of times you would look at a person who has a brain injury and think they're perfectly normal. They may not even have any external scarring or anything like that. And so you might assume that they may be behaving in a way that you don't understand, and you might assume that they're just being jerks, when in fact they have an injury, an impairment. So memory is a common one for brain injury, for example. And so many of people who have brain injuries are unable to go back to work again. And so they lose their work identity, which is a really painful thing. So acquired, right? So it could be an accident. It could be something like stroke, for example, can often have the same thing. And then on the physical side, we have physical impairments that impair your ability to perform ADLs or IADLs. And so you need some sort of supports in order to continue to live independently. So looking at some Census Bureau data, this is 2016, is the most recent report I've been able to find on this topic. But looking by age, so you can see, so the top bar in each of these is age 65 to 74. Then the light purple is 75 to 84, and then 85 and older is the dark purple. And you can see this is a percent of people by age group in the United States that have a disability of this sort. So vision, hearing, ambulation, right? And so you can see higher and higher percentages based on your age. Cognitive, right, being one of the ones that really makes it hard to live independently. And then how many people have basically these are difficulties with IADLs. If you read the description, difficulty doing errands alone, such as visiting a doctor's office or shopping, right? So almost half of people 85 and older have shortfalls in their IADLs that would make it hard for them to live alone. And then self-care, right? These are your ADLs, right? So almost a quarter of people over the age of 85 have some ADL limitation. So in order to keep people living independently, we need to address these issues with community-based services, home and community-based services, which we'll talk more about here in a second. So during dependency, what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to maintain residual function. So if you've had a loss of function, we want to make sure that you don't lose any more, right? So we're going to try to prevent further decline. And then we're going to try to find a way to restructure your life such that you can maintain a meaningful quality of life. And then, if possible, find ways to get you back to a state of independence. So to provide you with the supplements that you need in order to go back to a state of independence. So I've talked about Northeast Passage, which is an organization here at UNH that works with people with disabilities, and they have a whole adaptive sports program, which this is a photo of that, where they provide opportunities for people to do sporting, and not necessarily organized sports, but go out and do physical activity such as bicycling, right? And so if you've had maybe a brain injury where you can't balance yourself as well as you used to, you probably can't ride a two-wheel bike anymore, but you could have a sit-down recumbent tricycle bike where you don't have to have the balance, and it's safer, and you can still have some of the same experiences of being out in nature, getting exercise, feeling good about yourself. So these are meant to be supports that give you that quality of life despite what you've lost. So let's talk some of the specifics. So when someone experiences dependency, one of the things that we look at is case management. So if you're in an accident, for example, or you have a serious health condition such as a stroke, one of the things that we commonly see insurance companies get involved with is case management. And so looking at the patient's total needs, physical, medical, as well as psychosocial. So we address the physical and the medical, but we also want to address the emotional effects of learning to live with your disability. So that's where organizations like Northeast Passage step in and provide quality of life, try to restore quality of life. So if you had a stroke and you were a big bicycler and that was an important part of your identity, you're like, wow, now I can't do that anymore. Um, Organizations like Northeast Passage try to, come in and say, okay, well, you can't ride the two-wheel bike anymore, but here's another way that you can do much of what you used to do. So case managers evaluate that overall need and try to address the whole spectrum of the patient. And then they look at, what is available in the community to meet these needs. And, is it best to, maybe the person has such a significant need that the best way to take care of that person would be put them in an institution such as a nursing home. But maybe there are other opportunities that are community based. So home and community based resources. And then, what resources does the patient have in terms of finance? And that may, unfortunately may decide some of the options. Long-term services and supports, or LTSS, are services that address ADLs and IADLs that try to restore and maintain quality of life for the individual. And family members can often and can and do often step in to be case managers. I had a employee back in one of my branch managers who worked for me back in uh, a number of years ago. I won't say where. Her son worked on power lines, and he at one point was up on a power line and fell some 40 feet, broke his neck, and was and had brain injuries and was paralyzed. And so my my employee wound up retiring earlier than she had expected to, in order to become her son's case manager. And and the son then went to live with her, um, and she provided his care. So she was his official case manager on behalf of the on behalf of Medicaid, as well as the workers' disability insurance that her son had. And she was great. And I mean, if I ever needed a case manager, I would certainly want her to be representing me. A very strong person. Um, so her son was very lucky to have her. So, but we often see, not just as case managers, but we often see children, adult children caring for elderly parents, and some of you may have been exposed to that, or a parent caring for a severely disabled child. So someone who has a child with Down syndrome or severe autism, where the child may not be able to ever live independently. So we often see long-term service and supports provided by informal caregivers. And then we sometimes see professional case management, which is what I was kind of talking about earlier, provided by a managed care organization. So when we think about the long-term care continuum, we kind of think about it from home and community-based services. So we have the person in the community living at home, or in a communal setting of some sort, maybe living with family, out to the far other end of the spectrum, where they are institutionalized in some sort of high level specialized hospital. So going from the left to the right, we start with kind of that lower level, uh, most common informal care. So elderly family members, children with disabilities. Most of the care is going to be provided by a spouse or a parent or an adult child. So most care is provided in the informal sector by family members and friends. So kind of looking at that far end, there's no professional person involved necessarily in the informal care sector. Then we see other kinds of organizations starting to step in to provide personal care, such as organizations like churches will run Meals on Wheels programs, where they may bring food to an elderly person, and part of the function of Meals on Wheels is the food itself, right? The person may have difficulty cooking for themselves, and so the Meals on Wheels program brings food to the person. But these Meals on Wheels programs often also provide psychosocial support. So the person delivering the food, part of the function of the delivery is for the person to engage with the person who's trying to live independently and provide social interaction, so that the person, to avoid loneliness, which is leads to loneliness, leads to all sorts of other mental illness. And then as we start to think about formal care, we look at home health agencies, and you might see, and home health being provided by some sort of organization. So we can see, kind of, again, still at a low level, homemaker services. So if you have some limitations on your IADLs, such as being able to do housework, doing basic housework like cleaning, um, doing laundry, things like that, home health agencies will sometimes provide homemakers, people who are not medical providers, but come into a person's house and do basic housework that the person is not able to do. And that enables the person to stay and remain independent. So an elderly person living alone may not be able to do laundry anymore. So maybe a home health agency may send in a homemaker a home aide to do basic housework. And that keeps the person, that provides the level of IADLs in order to keep the person in the home. And this might, it doesn't necessarily have to be provided by a home health agency. It could be, provided, paid for by an adult child or something like that, right? But home health agencies now start to step in and provide certain care in the home to keep the person in the home. And this could also include medical care. Kind of moving along the spectrum, we also see, again, more formal care. Now we have outside the home senior centers. So this is a common thing we see in most communities, have senior centers, places where senior members of the community can gather, can have activities, can engage in social interaction. Again, isolation is a really dangerous thing for humans, right? We are naturally pack animals, and if we are too isolated, we tend to mentally decompensate. We run into a lot of problems, and then that leads to physical problems. So senior centers, this is not a medical intervention; it's a social intervention, and it is meant to kind of give people a place to go and provide community. You can also, kind of stepping it up, you can see adult daycare. So these adult daycare is like child daycare. Adult daycare is a facility, probably locked, meant for people who probably have some level of cognitive decline, probably memory care kind of things, where where maybe the person is living with an adult child, for example. The client is living with an adult child. The adult child needs to go to work during the day. And so the adult child takes the elderly parent who maybe has early stages of dementia or has memory loss to an adult daycare, which is sort of like a senior center, right? It's going to be where they are provided activities and meaningful social interaction and a safe space to be when the adult child is not able to provide to care for them. And it also provides respite for the adult child, so that you're not caring for your parent 24 hours a day. This is not These are typically not providing medical care of any sort. It's just supervised functioning during the course of a day. So it's not inpatient, it's not overnight, it's just during the day. Adult foster care is a program where maybe you know fairly high functioning elderly person, but doesn't have family members that they can live with, this is a program where families open their homes to people, elderly and people with mild dementia and so forth, and agree to care for them in their home. So it is in the home care, but with people who are not your family member. And then the next level up is assisted living. So this is, you've got some usually it's some IADLs. It's hard for you to cook. It's hard for you to do housework. And so you move into a facility that's a little bit like a hotel, right? So you'll have some sort of apartment. A lot of these that I've seen are like efficiency apartments where it's kind of, you don't have a full kitchen. You might have a microwave and a sink in your apartment. And then you have, communal eating. So this is a good option for people who have IADLs that can't be met in the community. And so this is our first kind of level of real institutional living. And then we graduate up to skilled nursing. And this is where usually with assisted living, you don't require any sort of skilled nursing. So it might be you need help remembering to take your medications, but you don't have wounds that need to be cared for. You generally can live, you probably have higher levels of cognitive ability. You just have some limitations and it could be some limitations on ADLs, such as bathing on your own. You might need assistance with bathing, but in the assisted living, there are very low levels of medical interventions. Skilled nursing, we step up now to requiring some level of medical oversight, medical monitoring, because of the level of fragility of the patient. And skilled nursing can include all the way up to, ventilated care. So you might be, unable to breathe on your own. And then finally, specialized care is a higher level, just kind of progressively a higher level of institutional care. This is really would be like where you have ventilated coma patients, things like that are very high levels, require very high levels of care, and all in an institutional setting. And this could include permanent commitment to psychiatric facilities, for example. Okay, so we talk about kind of different models of long-term care, long-term supports and services. So we can think about it in terms of home and community-based care versus facility-based care. So, for example, we can provide medical and personal services to help with daily living in either a home-based or a facility or institutional-based care. But what's the difference? Well, when you're in a home or community based, you're in your own home or with a family member. Whereas when you're in an institution, you're going to be in some sort of institution that's designed to provide those long-term supports and services in an institutional facility of some sort. Where are the services provided? Typically, in home and community based, you're typically going to get your care in the home, or you may go out to a community provider. Whereas if you're in a facility, the services are generally going to come to you because your requirements are so high. But it could be, if you're in a nursing home, you'll often go get transported to a hospital, for example, or a clinic to see a specialist. And then how is it paid for? Well, one of the interesting things is there are a number of programs where home and community-based services, family members can sometimes be certified by insurance companies and actually paid. So my former colleague who was caring for her injured son got certified and was actually being paid by a combination of Medicaid and workers' compensation insurance as the case manager and provider for her injured son. But very often it's like I mentioned, informal care. On the other hand, if you're in an institutional setting, of course, you're paying the institution, and long-term care facilities are very expensive. Uh, we're talking $5,000 a month for to five to $10,000 a month for assisted living, and maybe $7,000 to $15,000 a month for skilled nursing, depending on the level of injury and complexity of the patient. So it's very expensive. So in terms of trying to reduce the amount of money that we spend on healthcare, trying to keep people in the home can save a lot of money. But of course, it needs to be the appropriate level of care. So I mentioned the Krempel Center. This is a fabulous organization that I work with, and this is an example of community-based services. So Krempel Center provides, again, this is for people who have had an acquired brain injury. So they've been in a car accident, had a stroke, something, and they what the Krempel Center does is provides community-based services. So this is not a medical program. This is a social program where people get together. They do work on things they're concerned about, like understanding their memory issues. And so it is a occupational therapy, recreational therapy model. But we do not treat the clients as patients. Right. So it's a day program. It's a place for people with brain injury to come to feel like they're part of a community. And again, one of the hardest things about brain injury is a person who has an acquired brain injury often looks just like anybody else. There isn't an obvious outward physical manifestation typically where you can tell that the person has had a brain injury, and so you want to treat them uh, uh, you know so they are treated with understanding that they have something going on. But also, most people who have had a brain injury have, as a result, have had as a result a loss of some important part of their identity, such as being able to work. I mentioned the ICU nurse that I know, um, who had a brain injury and came to the Krempel Center, and because she was unable to go back to work. And so one of the things that I hear from the clients at the Krempel Center is, one of the important things about the Krempel Center is that it's a community. It is a community of people who have all suffered similar losses, and so everybody understands what everybody else is going through. And a lot of times, people, you know, it's helpful to have a community of people who really do understand the things that you have lost. So it's a really lovely organization. And we have those of you, I think a couple of you are in the OT program, so you'll probably have a chance to go work there. So other kinds of um, organizations include uh, uh, psychiatric hospitals. You can have long-term commitment to a psychiatric hospital. So One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was a movie that came out in, I want to say, the 70s, and it really highlighted some of the terrible treatment that people were receiving in in institutional settings, in particular for psychiatric care. And Jack Nicholson, that's Jack Nicholson here. You may be familiar with him. Plays a criminal who pleads insanity in order to get sentenced. Instead of being sentenced to jail, he's sentenced uh, to a psychiatric hospital, and kind of winds up causing all sorts of mayhem. It's a great movie. It is a tragic movie, but it had a real impact on the community. It had a real impact in the United States in terms of the deinstitutionalization movement, in particular for psychiatric care, and helped impact the movement to reduce the number of people who are in long-term psychiatric care. Now, psychiatric hospitals are an example of what we call a total institution. And total institutions really are the opposite of capabilities, in the sense that they limit they limit every aspect of an individual's life. So confinement to a mental asylum, which is what we historically called them, or a prison, or basic training for those, if any of you have gone into the military, right? They limit your choices, but unlike basic training, as long as you're there, the confinement and the limitations never end. And these are kind of extreme examples. And one of the questions that we have to consider is has the deinstitutionalization movement gone too far? There are many individuals who really should be in institutions because they lack IADLs, the ability to care for themselves in the community. They lack the resources, they lack the family support in order to live on their own. And as a result, wind up very often homeless or in jail. So I was talking about a total institution, so you should be familiar with this. This concept was developed by a sociologist named Irving Goffman in his book Asylums. And one of a total institution, so I'll give you the formal kind of definition here, is a place of residence or work where a large number of people of like situated individuals are cut off from the wider society for an appreciable time and lead an enclosed and formally administrative round of life. So this is an example of a psychiatric hospital for you are cut off from the larger life. A prison is an example of a total institution, and basically your activities of daily life are carried out in lockstep in large batches. So everybody goes and eats together. It's 7 a.m. Everybody gets up. Everybody goes and gets washed up from 7 to 7:30. Then we have breakfast from 7:30 to 8:30. Then we go do something else from 8:30 to whatever. And then, we all have lunch at 12, and then we all go do something else. And then we all have dinner together, and we all go to bed at 9 o'clock, and then we start over again. And what is dehumanizing about these experiences is they take away your individual identity, your individual choice, your individual agency. And so that's why we have, that's a big part of why we have pushed so hard against institutional solutions, and in particular for mental health, because we recognize that people who are mentally ill aren't criminals. It shouldn't be treated like a prison. And I think most psychiatric hospitals today aren't run like prisons. They have caring people who are trying to do the best they can. We've come a long, long way since the time of psychiatric institutions that were portrayed in movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But total institutions, it's an interesting concept and something to think about. Now, a nursing home, you could think of it as a total institution, and historically, some of them were run somewhat like total institutions with very little flexibility and so when you're trying to take care of 100 or 150 elderly people, and you've got to feed them, help them with personal care, provide them activities, it's really easy for an organization to slip into a kind of total institution approach. We all do this at this time, we all do this at this time, right? And so good nursing homes have to strike a balance between trying to provide all the services that are necessary in as efficient and economical a manner as possible, because nursing homes are chronically underpaid. And so balancing, the need to do everything efficiently and at as little cost as possible, with balancing that against the needs of individuals to be individuals, to have some choice about, when do I want to get up? I'm a 75-year-old man. I want to be able to get up when I feel like getting up, by God, and a nursing home becomes the person's home. There isn't it's not like we do have temporary stays, of course, for rehabilitation purposes, but many people go to a nursing home and that becomes their home. That's where they're going to live out the rest of their days. And so we don't want them to feel like they're living in a prison. And so I use the example of the Edgewood Center, which is a skilled nursing facility, a nursing home. We call nursing homes, depending on the level of care, skilled nursing uh, facilities or SNFs. You may hear that skilled SNF becomes SNF, right? So the Edgewood Center is a skilled nursing facility in Portsmouth. It's run by a grad of HMP, Trisha Cummings, who's a fabulous person. And I've spent some time at Edgewood, and it is a beautiful nursing home. And the people that work there are really caring, and it's a really great place. And there are a lot of beautiful nursing homes, throughout the United States that take really good care of their residents. And so it is not like the total institution described by Goffman, especially when you have somebody who's talented and caring like Trisha running the facility. There's a guy named Bill Thomas. He's a doctor who got involved in the 70s, got involved in reforming nursing homes, and he's written a number of books. And I have you watching a short video with him. And he looked at the conditions of nursing homes in the 70s, and he saw that they were functioning on something of a total institution model as described by Goffman. And so he's been a reformer working in the long-term care field for years, and he's developed what he calls the Eden alternative. And the Eden alternative is to try to restructure the way that nursing homes operate to focus on these domains of well-being. So identity, having people acknowledge you as a human being, have them know something about who you are and what your story is. Growth, even in a nursing home, even toward the end of life, we still as humans want to grow. And so one of the goals of the Eden alternative is to provide developmental and enrichment programming to keep the mind working and thinking. Autonomy, right? So we respect people's agency, give them some ability to have some self-determination, some choice. And this is a tough one, right? So this is when you're trying to run a large facility with a lot of people in it, and provide them a safe environment, provide for, many of them are going to need help with their ADLs, providing that personal care. And so on the one hand, trying to balance running it efficiently and safely at the other, but at the same time, giving people the ability to choose, like, hey, no, I don't want to eat at 7:30. I'd rather eat at 9. How do you do all that? And so the Eden Alternative really tries to look at those kinds of, how do we build those kinds of options into the operation? Security, of course, is perhaps the most important thing about nursing homes, and it's the reason why we put our loved ones in a facility is to make sure that they are in fact safe. And that's usually the reason why they go there to begin with, is because they can't be cared for safely in the home. Connectedness, so having a sense of belonging, and then meaning, right? So even at that stage of life, having things to do, having a purpose is really important. And then joy, right? So finding ways to celebrate life and still enjoy life. These are all really important things. And I tie this back to Amartya Sen and his discussion of functionings and beings, right? You're trying to be a full functioning human being. So I really like the Eden Alternative, and Bill Thomas has got a number of great books out there that I really recommend you explore them if you're interested in issues around aging. Now, one of the challenges that's well known, and I started to discuss this, was deinstitutionalization. That has, and the movement for deinstitutionalization has led many mentally ill patients to be shifted back to the community. And there's a lack, and the problem is that we basically said, hey, let's shut down, these mental health, these psychiatric hospitals, these mental health institutions. They're cruel, and it's not necessary to have everybody, with medications and treatment today. We can get people out of these institutions, and get them back into the community in a much more humane, have them live more humane and meaningful lives. But what we've seen is, while that's all a great idea that takes resources, and what we've seen is that there just aren't enough resources provided. And so what we see in a lot of cases is sort of we take people who are mentally ill, pull them out of institutions and put them back in the community, and then we don't provide them care. And as a result, they wind up being homeless, often, often abusing substances, using drugs to kind of self-medicate. So people like my friend Eric, when he is ill, doesn't believe that he's sick. He doesn't understand that he's sick. And so a lot of people with mental illness don't think that they're sick. They don't believe they're sick. And so they don't seek care. And as a result, when they're really in a state where they are dependent, but there's no one to care for them, they fall through the cracks. And one of the cracks that they often fall through is they fall into the criminal justice system. And so it's estimated that some, 10 to 20% of jail inmates have serious mental illness. The percentages are higher for just general mental illness. Some estimate as high as 60%. The proportion of jail inmates with serious mental illness is 3 to 6 times the rate of the general population. So what you see here is a lot of people who have mental illness, they're not treated, right? There are insufficient resources put to care for people in the community. So insufficient home and community-based services for people with psychiatric needs. And as a result, they wind up in the criminal justice system, and in prison instead of getting psychiatric care, possibly institutional care. Now, we've talked about the demography, and so one of the challenges that the United States faces and other countries face is the aging of our populations. And so almost all of the developed world, Europe, America, Japan, have significant demographic decline, which means that they have a lot more elderly than they do babies, right? And young people. So a society that has a nice pyramid like the one on the left here that was back in 1960, you have a lot of young people coming up, and as a result, those young people are going to move into the workforce. They'll get taxed. They'll pay, their taxes can pay for Medicare and Medicaid, which then cares for the elderly. But as healthcare has improved and lifespans have gotten longer, we're seeing more and more people living into their late 80s. And, it used to be like when I was a kid, hearing that somebody had turned 100 was like amazing. Now, like every nursing home's got 3 or 4, people who are over the age of 100. So it's a common thing. It's really not even remarkable anymore. And at the same time, we're having fewer babies, and so the population looks more like a column, or even if you look at some countries like Italy, it's actually an inverted pyramid where they have fewer young people and a lot of old people. The problem with that is a couple of things. One is when you have a very few elderly people, it's relatively easy to get enough, children of elderly parents or community-based resources to care for a handful of elderly people. But when the elderly people outnumber the young people, just finding the people to provide the physical care necessary, and then couple with that the costs of providing the care, when you have a wide-based pyramid with more people working than people retired, you have more resources available. But when you have a pyramid that looks more like a column, you wind up with more people retired, or as many people retired as are working, and trying to tax the people who are still working to provide for the people who are retired or are, need to be in assisted living or skilled nursing. That becomes very expensive when there are fewer workers to provide. So we're headed in this direction. This is a real challenge that the United States is going to face, but we're not alone. All of Europe, China, uh, and Japan, some of the most populous countries in the world, have real problems with this. Now, one way we could deal with that is long-term care insurance, but long-term care insurance has basically been destroyed by the death spiral, which we talked about back in chapter 6, right? When we talked about the death spiral was who's the most likely to buy long-term care insurance? Well, the people who are most likely to need it. As a result, the prices go up and people opt out of the insurance, and then the insurance becomes more expensive, and then more people opt out, and then the insurance becomes more expensive, and eventually the whole market unwinds. There is some long-term care insurance out there still, but it really isn't a functional market anymore. So we basically don't have long-term care insurance or insurance that would basically pay for skilled nursing, being institutionalized in a skilled nursing facility or an assisted living facility. So it's really hard to buy that kind of insurance now. It's ridiculously expensive, and so most people just don't get it. Instead, they assume that they're going to function off of private savings, or they're just going to roll the dice. But most people don't have sufficient private savings. Again, I said that, you know, assisted living facilities run $5,000 to $10,000 a month. So you think about that, a month, not a year. $5,000 to $10,000 a month for assisted living, 7,000 to 15,000 a month for skilled nursing facilities, so nursing homes, right? And people are going to run out of savings pretty quick. Most people don't have that kind of money. Now, who pays for most long-term care? Medicaid, frankly, right? And we talked about that. Medicaid is a program for basically a poverty program, right? And so Medicaid pays for most institutional long-term care in the United States. But in order to qualify for that, in order to qualify for Medicaid, you have to spend down to what I would call destitution. So in New Hampshire, that used to be you would have to spend all your money until you had only $1,500 left in the bank. You couldn't own a house anymore. You'd have to sell your house. You have to sell your car. You have to sell everything. And you're only allowed to have $1,500 in the bank. So imagine that. You've saved your whole life. You have you had a nice house, and you wind up with some sort of condition that requires that you go into a nursing home. And in order to qualify for Medicaid, you have to, you're going to have to pay for that care in the nursing home until basically you run out of money, at which point then Medicaid will start paying for the care. And Medicaid doesn't pay well to the facilities. So the facilities struggle to continue to provide care when they have too many Medicaid, when they have too many residents who are living in the facility on Medicaid. So it's a so this whole, the financing of long-term care, particularly on the institutional side, is really a disaster in the United States. So on that happy note, we'll leave long-term care, and next time we'll talk about special populations.